Hi everyone, I'm Caroline Daniel. I'm a partner at Brunswick and former Financial Times journalist. So hopefully I have done this before.
Thank you so much.
We're here to talk about building trust and transformation. And I'm just going to very quickly introduce our panelists for those who haven't done the homework. Hopefully I have. So on my right, I have Ashley Casovan, who's the Executive Director of Responsible AI Institute, also the former Director of Data and Digital for the Canadian government. So any Canadians in the room?
Just me? What?
One over here.
Yeah!
Drinks later. We have Joey Jegerajan, who's a PwC partner and board member and responsible for technology and risk. And then we have Mayank Prakash, who's the president of the British Computer Society. He's the COO of Evelyn Partners, which changed their name this morning, so look them up to find out what it was called before. And also, he's a non-executive director at Uber UK. So any questions about Uber UK, obviously, all go to him afterwards. And finally, Marc Warner, who's the CEO of Faculty AI. So what we're here today is obviously talk about trust and transformation. I'm going to start with an anecdote, which is always a great way to start a panel. And this one goes back to 1589 and a leading technology innovation, which is called the new knitting machine. So this is a story about the impact of technology and transformation in the 16th century, obviously, which is the title of our panel. And what happened was William Lee applied for a patent for his new knitting machine to the Queen. And the first Queen Elizabeth denied him the patent, arguing that, consider thou what the invention could do to my poor subjects, and assuredly bring them to ruin by depriving them of employment and making them beggars as a result. So I think that's the frame for our panel about trust and transformation. Is it always good? Does it always lead to more benefits for humans and workers in particular? And what I'd like to start with the panel is looking at that particular challenge. What's the biggest impact you see at the moment between trust in technology and transformation? I'm going to start with you.
Sure. It's a good question, right? So we have about 4,000 technologists in our practice, and we talk about this a lot. I think in a human-led, tech-powered world, arguably it's easier to build trust within isolated solutions. But the way we look at it is, how do you build trust in the broader ecosystem, right? When you've got a number of organizations needing to collaborate to drive society forward. So if I take the financial markets as an example, over decades and decades, we've had data, technology companies creating ERPs, we have regulators, standards, and now we have a system that works. Arguably, you think maybe confidence and trust in the financial markets is dropping a bit, but when organizations create P&Ls and balance sheets and it's audited and it's verified, we make investment decisions off the back of that, right? It's taken a long time, and we could only ever do that with a community of solvers, with a number of organizations and an ecosystem working together. And so I think the biggest risk here around trust is we all in the crowd here, we don't work together, right? And arguably we're motivated by different things. If we don't have a common purpose and work together, we're not building trust. We might build trust in our own point solutions, but that's not driving society forward.
So Ashley, if you look at this question from where you sit, where do you think the biggest sort of challenge is at managing sort of issues of trust and responsibility and transformation?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of, it's not my opinion, there's a lot of sentiment analysis that's been done quite recently on understanding the implications of technology and how it's impacting people, and then therefore the trust related to that. And not only is it low, it's low where it matters or it's impacting somebody's lives. So if we think about using technology for health services or predicting your insurance, these are things that can impact your livelihood or your wealth, and therefore it's something that people don't know that they can actually trust a human or a machine to do that, where a human would have done that previously. And so I think that thinking, as we're saying, about the ecosystem of regulators, of the service providers, and the work that they need to do to try and call out some of those challenges that have been identified by the surveys that have been done, to try and establish an understanding of how to mitigate some of the potential concerns that come from that, through things like regulations, through things like having the work that we're doing, I'm sure I'll share more, trust marks or certification marks, to try and think through what does good and effective look like, and has that been adjudicated in an independent and an authoritative manner?
Mayank, the same question to you.
Well, I'll take two perspectives. The first one is one that over 60,000 members of the British Computer Society, the Chartered Institute for IT, repetitively say, which is trust is what constrains us from exploring the potential of technology. Now, that's much better understood by the audience here than by the millions of users of technologies, and therein lies our question and challenge, which is if technology may be fantastic, but if people don't trust it, they're not going to let it do things that explore its full potential. And then the other thing I'd say is, for me, the choice is really simple, and it is about choice. If technology removes human discretion, then it loses trust. And we all have different choices we want to make. But if technology lets us make choice so that you can be yourself, you can explore who you want to be, that I think is at the core of human spirit and is at the core of maintaining trust.
Marc, finally, obviously, trust is sort of central to sort of faculty's mission and how you build trust, and particularly in AI in your case. Do you want to just talk about where you see some of the biggest points of tension at the moment between that sort of trust debate?
Totally, yeah. So at faculty, we've done, well, now probably many hundreds of different AI projects with a whole variety, like from governments to startups to large companies. And over the last few years, we've taken a look at our best work, and we think there's a common theme that runs through it. Basically, we are not at the level of human level artificial general intelligence, right? We can bank that. Hopefully, we won't be for quite some time.
Isn't it always 20 years away?
Hopefully that stays true. But in the intermediate time, the AI is still a very powerful technology. But given that it's not a general intelligence, that basically tells you it has to be used to support humans, right? The combination of the machine and the human intelligence are most effective. And so we've started focusing much more on what we now call decision intelligence. So helping people to find particular decisions and then integrating AI, or broadly just data insights, into that decision so that they can effectively drive what they want to do. So that is nice for a bunch of reasons. One, it means you always have human in the loop. So you naturally get some elements of the trust that you'd get a human doing it on their own. But we've also invested really heavily in what we call AI safety, so ensuring that algorithms are fair, private, robust, and explainable. And so that combination allows us to then, when people are making those decisions, to actually explain to them what's happening. So, probably the most public example of that was the work we did with the NHS when we were helping them predict COVID patients across the country. So every day at sort of 5:30, we'd sit down with the C-suite of the NHS and the commander of the COVID response, a person called Keith Willett, and we would help them understand what was going to happen across the country and individual hospitals across in different places. And for them, of course, these were literally life and death decisions, and it was totally critical that they understood and trusted the system. And so we were able to build in a bunch of the AI safety technology. We were able to make it so that, this was never about automating the decisions. It was always about surfacing the insights for them. And we also built in a bunch of functionality that made the history of the predictions open to them. So they could check back and look at how the real data, what the predictions were and how the real data fell. And that meant that they trusted it the right amount. Because, of course, the faculty is not asking for anyone to trust our algorithms perfectly. We want them to trust it the right amount, which is often very good, but still needs to be built in with a level of human judgment.
So can your AI help build more trust in Boris Johnson?
I think that might be a lost cause.
I heard something there around building human imperfection, right? That's
a very nice output. Right? You should be a diplomat. I'm going to turn to the issue of governance of AI and technology in particular, and where it sits in an organisation, particularly in business. So there's a few sort of seemingly good facts and alongside some bad facts from some consulting companies recently. One looked at AI governance and looked at 850 companies globally, and it said that 65% of them had implemented responsible AI governance frameworks. but yet only 30% of them had actually been implemented. So it's a pretty big gap in terms of even those who are trying to talk about it in the right way. That's a pretty big gap from big companies, and these are some of the biggest companies in the world. Second was from PwC, which also showed that 3/4 have formed ethical guidance in place, but just 1 in 5 had ethical frameworks, and just 35% of them had plans to improve governance. So what's fascinating about that is the disconnect between everyone sort of realize that they get that they have to be doing something, but the implementation of it and the follow-up from many of the biggest companies in the world isn't really there yet. So I wonder if I can start with you, Ashley, on that, about that disconnect and whether you see that in the work that you're doing around AI accreditation and what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks. And I really want to build off of where Marc left off, which is saying that these AI systems or technology generally needs to have these safety criticalities thought about. And then for those of you that were tracking what he said, really started to define when we're talking about what does trustworthy AI or responsible AI or ethical AI, common terms he's already alluded to, robustness, safety, trustworthiness, explainability, and these are all things, fairness. These are all things that as a community we're trying to have common definitions around so that it moves away from boards or organizations saying, oh yeah, we got this. We've set up a governance committee or we've put some principles in place with not only limited follow through as you're indicating, but follow through to what extent and against what evaluation. And so part of the challenge that we have is, do those terms all mean the same thing? And I'm sure that, Marc, you did an excellent job in thinking through that and using really good research that is available, but that's not something that a lot of efforts being made to do within these organizations to take a really strong investment to think through what the implications are of actually implementing AI in a responsible and trustworthy manner.
But if we go forward, can you just sort of unpack what AI auditing will look like?
Yeah.
I mean, in the way we've got ESG has obviously become a massive issue about how to sort of have accreditation, including the challenges of is the data useful? Are we going to see a landscape when every company will have to have something on their website which is a check by an auditor to say the AI is working the right way? What is that going to? Can you just unpack?
That's my main goal in life right now is to do that. And so we've actually just launched a pilot with Standards Council of Canada, to review the framework that we've developed to respond to the framework around defining what does responsible AI actually mean with some of those qualities and characteristics that I just mentioned. And in that context, part of this pilot is to understand what that end-to-end implementation actually means. And for us, that's an independent audit. And so Ernst & Young has agreed to be the auditor for that, for this first phase. And what we're trying to understand through that is not just how do you evaluate this, but through an independent process. And so we're just like any other financial type of audits, processes, or for those involved with cybersecurity, SOC 2 certifications, really trying to define that, understand then also what does good look like? What are the appropriate evaluation criteria that an auditor can go in and say, yes, you've completed this task to a satisfaction that's been agreed upon. And we're doing that through, as an independent nonprofit organization, and that's why I mentioned independence and authoritativeness earlier, not only going through that formal verification process with, in this case, Standards Council of Canada, but we're seeking to do that now with UCAS and ANSI, UCAS in the UK and ANSI in the US as well, who have agreed to do a harmonized review because technology doesn't have physical boundaries in the same way that our laws do. And so doing that across these countries is quite important. So we'll tell you about the pilot.
Yeah.
Could I add one thing, Caroline, just because my competitor EY was mentioned? So if I could just get something in.
We're only allowed one. I'll make sure that only one consultant, is mentioned.
I'm looking for their logo. No, I'm joking. To build off what you just said, right?
Yeah.
I think this gets to the heart and the crux of trust, actually, and it's why I was talking at the start about the ecosystem. So you mentioned ESG. So we take ESG. So one thing that we've created is something called Rewired Earth, which is the community organisation. We founded it, but it's open source effectively. The goal and the ultimate aim here is to create an end-to-end trusted network where if you take an organisation, right, that literally requires things pulled out of the ground, going through a huge supply chain, creates a product and hits the end consumer, right? That's so much broader than just one technology. And ultimately what we need to do is create a trusted network where every system, where every regulator is involved, we have metrics, we have standards, we have government involved, setting basically what we did with the financial markets over decades, but doing it immediately over ESG. So I think the broader question for me is we can do point solutions, but how do we create the whole ecosystem? And until we really get there, I don't think we'll ever truly trust ESG or sustainability reporting. And that's an example of why I think we need to make a real step change.
So as we come to issues of trust in technology more broadly, what are some of the issues you're finding working with boards? So, I mean, I work with a lot of different kinds of boards, and I find that there's a massive disconnect between how far they actually understand not just the terms, but any of the technologies, and what kind of questions they should be asking. So I'd be interested, both from you and then Marc as well, on how do we help companies be better at asking the right questions in the governance framework? Because if they don't get it and it's the sort of left to the technologists, how do you get that right balance?
It's a good question. So I suppose, so two thematics I'll pick up, right? And I wouldn't say anyone's solved this yet, but when I speak to boards, two things that are coming out compared to even 2 or 3 years ago. Organizations are demanding real-time forward-looking insight and trust. And so there's an element of, they don't want information to be reported backwards. They need the trust to have the data and the tech to report forward. So there's something around real-time and forward-looking, which is what we need our technology to get to help organizations really make fast decisions and effectively, win in a very, very competitive world. The second thing I'd say is transparency. So if you take Gen Z right now, right? Gen Z are all born with a smartphone in their pocket, right? Now, there's two schools of thought here. One school of thought is that they truly need transparency, right? And they're very purpose-built. The other school of thought is that they will join any social media platform as long as it's the hottest to drive social interaction. So it depends where you land, right? But ultimately, they are requiring more and more transparency. And from a governance perspective, real-time, fast, forward-looking, and transparent data, whether there's an auditing stamp that we could trust it, or whether there's a big consulting company, or whether actually it's part of an ecosystem that's governed by regulators, the nature of the data is real-time, forward-looking, and transparent.
Mayank, I wonder if I can bring you in here on, you obviously worked in government and you're sort of involved in advising Uber. What are some of the differences you see between how they have gone about trying to build trust in their technologies?
Well, I'd make two observations. The first one is learn from others. And then don't try and invent the entire wheel yourself. Doesn't matter who you are and how many resources you have. There is value in working with organizations like Responsible AI, Turing Institute, BCS. Learn from others so that you can actually build on that. And my second observation would be there's a lot of hype here. And I know I have a reputation for straight talking, but there's a lot of hype here.
In what area?
Just almost every part of AI. The word AI itself is overhyped. 9 times out of 10 at the receiving end of solutions that I'm pitched from organizations and consulting firms, not naming any names. Yeah.
The others.
It is machine learning being pitched as AI. And that's the hard reality of where we are today. But actually, if I go back to more generalization, just like, we are in an amazing building here, creating something requires more than just the content and the materials. It requires deep thought. For a building to have character, that requires deep thought. Similarly, if you as an organization want to create AI principles and values, give that some deep thought. Test it with use cases. Test it with misuse cases. Are you going to be okay with a scenario where it tests fairness but compromises on privacy for your clients? When the push comes to shove, where are you going to vote on that decision? We were talking about ESG. The reality is we now have the world's biggest carbon producers are also the most responsible organizations. If you look at shareholders, not naming any organization. Greenwashing is so popular. It's more popular than ESG programs at present. So just look deeply, test use cases and misuse cases so that your principles withstand the test of time.
I want to bring in Marc on. You have something that you do with CEOs and chairmen because you sort of realise that actually educating boards is kind of important to how you actually implement AI programs effectively, not just responsibly. I wonder if you can just talk about your experience of sort of the naivety of some of the companies, not naming your clients obviously, but some of clients in general about what they think AI is going to do, and actually what kind of questions they should be asking.
Yeah, well, I actually think there's an interesting angle on this that isn't really being appreciated. So whenever anyone hears like trust in AI, they always assume that it means the kind of downside risk. So AI is going to be bad. But like, if you take a look around, our institutions are failing, and we're like, all the trust in our institutions is going off a cliff. And that's probably fundamentally because they're just not making good decisions at its core. And so for us, when we talk to executives, a whole load of the concern about being trusted is also just providing the things that their citizens or patients or customers need. So like, when you're compared to Amazon, when everyone's daily experience is, the top tech companies, and then you can't provide the services and you send the wrong thing or you deliver somebody goes to the wrong appointment, or they have to fill in their name and address 5 times when they go to a doctor's appointment, a hospital appointment, all these kinds of things. There's enormous trust lost with people on that side of things as well. So I think when we're talking to people, we're trying to have a more honest conversation about the upsides and the downsides. It's very easy to sit on a stage and sort of take the moral high ground of AI is going to be terrible, and we need to make sure that everything is trusted. But of course, for a bunch of applications, for very small things that have very low impact, it doesn't really matter. Like whether it's a red jumper or a blue jumper that goes top of a website is not the sort of thing that needs an independent audit. Actually there, you just let people get on with it and let them take the risk.
Depends which football club it involves.
That is true. If football comes into it, maybe it is more important. But I guess from our perspective, this question of trust is much broader and requires a consideration of both the upsides. Like, damage happens when you don't give your patients, citizens, customers the best service possible.
Yep.
Damage happens if you're irresponsible on the downside. And now, so for us, a lot of the education we do is trying to give senior execs an intuition somewhere between the AI is all hype and there's nothing there, or AI is magic and it's just going to solve any problem. The truth is, somewhere in between. There's very powerful technology for an important set of problems, and used correctly can be game-changingly valuable. But it's about trying to help them build an understanding of that. And it's actually not that hard. It takes a few hours to take people through on a journey enough to build some kind of an intuition for it.
And just want to talk about that, about how far the media in particular spend too much time thinking about the risks of AI and regulation of AI, and actually not enough time writing about what's actually working and how do you actually do this stuff well, not just in AI, but in digital transformations in general. What would you say to that?
So I think it's very clear if you look at the media landscape, there's a negativity bias, and I don't think we're going to fix that very easily. You and I have tried to some extent in the past. And so I think that is inherent and will continue to be true. But it's important for people in this room to represent some of the positives as well. Not to go irresponsibly, right? It has to be done well. It has to be done with the right safety considerations. But you actively harm if you don't embrace these things as well. So you don't get a free choice to just kind of avoid all the time.
I want to come back with actually just one quick question, which is the debate we had about what AI is and ML. And actually, if people can't actually understand what the words are, how can you build trust in something which is so ephemeral in terms of people's understanding of the actual words? And you're at the cutting edge of trying to understand how do we certify what is an AI program and audit against it? How are you finding that problem? Because it's pretty hard that no one defines it well and everyone just has a broad brush kind of definition.
Completely, and I don't know that it even matters that, maybe I'll say this very controversially. I don't think that the definition of AI matters, and I say this often when we're talking to standards organizations around that, and I can understand organizations that want to know, okay, well, I'm buying a real AI system or not. Fine, for comparability in the market purposes. But I think Marc's making really important points in outlining that we really need to just understand if the technology is fit for purpose. Do you need to use AI? Do you need to use really good data processing? And whether or not that's called AI or not doesn't really matter. But what does matter is the same guardrails or oversights. And one of the other things that Marc picked up on is really recognizing when you need what type of oversight. And so a lot of the regulations are trying to factor this in. The work that we did in Canada was the first national government to look at the implications. And it was for exactly the reason that Marc's talking about, is the potential benefits. When you have people that are waiting 8, 10, 12 months to have a visa processed because they're waiting on humans to be doing it, you have to take a look and think, okay, well, there's probably technology that can help us to advance and expedite these processes, especially if we know that 98% of them are going to be accepted. And so what are the ways that technology can help? And so federal governments, in the Canadian context, we have 236 different departments, many lines of business and services related to that. Technology can absolutely help that, but there's different risk implications. So if you're processing visas, that can be tricky if you're not doing it in low risk scenarios. And there's already criteria that's been set up for humans to go through those processes that can then be applied in those contexts. So I just go back to whether or not we call it AI doesn't really matter until we're trying to understand how to provide that oversight. What is different about AI than other types of technologies is when we think about it in terms of, does it learn? Is it changing? Is it teaching itself? And therefore, is the system continuing to act the same way? And that requires different types of monitoring and therefore oversight processes. And so that's where we really need to take this into account. To Marc's point, though, most of it's not even doing that yet. So is it fit for purpose? Do you need to use AI? I think is the first question we need to ask ourselves.
Hi, I wonder if I can bring you in from the British Computer Society perspective on government regulation in this area. Where do you think the government has actually helped build trust by intervening in terms of its policies?
I'm not sure I know of a single example, this could be controversial, I'm not sure I know of a single example where any government around the world has got this right. I think we are on a learning journey at present. I think several governments around the world are very progressive. For me, this is back to technology has huge potential to do good for mankind, because our biggest problems are the biggest opportunities for us to solve. And there is absolutely no doubt, I'm sure we'll universally agree here, that technology is going to be part of the solution. And we need to explore that upside potential of technology and look at what is right to achieve the outcome that is being looked at. To Marc and Ashley's point, doesn't have to be whiz-bang technology 9 out of 10 times. Doesn't have to be anywhere close to a GAN and to actually solve for most decisions that most organizations make. And so this is pretty mature. It's here now. It's about safe implementation. It's about professionalization. It's about making sure you get the basics right. If you train a technology to make decisions on the basis of data that doesn't represent the decisions you want, well, guess what? You're going to get an outcome that's not fit for purpose. And governments really care about it. I'll add one more aspect, which is rightly so, I think governments care to get the last 2% right. And I say this as somebody who's been in government and is now not in. It's important that the 2% of people who break laws are looked after, because that makes for a safer society for us. It's important that the 2% of people who need help and support are looked after. It's important that that 2% is got right. We can't just get 98% right when you are in government, because society counts on you being right. I am a huge advocate for what my colleagues are advocating, which is to use technology to explore the upside.
Just sticking briefly with regulation, the EU AI Act, do we think this is a force for good or another GDPR?
Do you want to go first, Marc?
We're smiling because in the green room earlier we were debating this hotly.
I mean, these things are very hard to get right in the very early days of a technology. So there is such a danger if you, imagine a silly little world where, there were two uses for steel. One was for guns and one was for girders. And you were trying to regulate at the level of steel. You could choose very restrictive regulation, so you didn't get any guns in your society, or you could choose very lax registration, so you got enough girders. Sorry, this is poorly explained, but nevertheless, you basically understand that if you try and regulate at a single technology that spans multiple applications, each with very different harms, you're forced to choose something that aggregates across all of them and is not right for any of them. And so, in principle, AI regulation, well, certainly AI regulation in particular circumstances is profoundly important. The critical question is, do you approach it as AI, where you're regulating medical diagnosis the same as red jumper versus blue jumper, or do you do it in a domain-specific way? And it seems to me at the moment, the tendency, because we don't really understand how this stuff is going to be used in practice really effectively yet, the temptation is to try and regulate this level of just AI, which is the equivalent of just regulating at the level of steel or something like that, and you just end up with all kinds of crazy unforeseen implications.
So the EU AI Act, though, does distinguish. I'm going to come off and sound like I'm pro-regulation all the time, which I totally am, but in a way that is meaningful and makes sense and measured and requires conformity assessments, aka certifications. But the EU AI Act, so there's a lot of problems with it. It will be my caveat on that, which we can detail later. But the pros of it are that it was one of the first to identify that there is a distinction between all types of AI systems, or that they're not all the same, and therefore was turning to look at not only the applications, but then the risk associated with that, and having requirements for just high-risk applications. And then part of one of the big problems is what's the definition of that, and then they're requiring an inventory of all of these, which is an impossible task. That said, it does make that distinction. I think where that is an accurate statement, though, when thinking about this oversight, is there really one body that can oversee all types of AI applications, or do we say, okay, well, maybe the Transportation Safety Act needs to be updated or improved, or health services standards, the FDA software as a medical device needs to be updated to integrate these different implications. So I want to make that clarification because regulators often get a very bad rap, and it's fair. There's not enough support, I think, to understand the implications of these technologies. Governments should be funded better for technology, but we are starting to at least get some more maturity. And the last thing I'll say on the EU AI Act is that in its current phase, its draft, does require conformity assessments. So then there's back to the point about the ecosystem, which is super, super important. And for the record, it's just EY in the pilot. You'll have your chance. And PwC already has management system certification accreditation, so you'll be able to do it. But the point is that it does require that entire ecosystem to understand how do you identify what the problems are, how do you then put the right regulations in place, and the role that they're playing right now is to say, thou shalt do this, now demonstrate conformity against that in an appropriate way, and that's where the standards within the ecosystem support it, and independent auditors play a critical role in demonstrating that value.
I'm just going to ask one last question of the panel before moving it up to questions from everyone else. Can't stop but ask a question about the Washington Post article with the interview with the Google engineer who got fired for arguing that the AI chatbot from Google was sentient. Interestingly, in some of the reporting, he was also trying to hire a lawyer, an attorney to represent Lambda, the software system, to claim that it was actually an independent actor and should have its own legal representation, which I think is a fascinating area we're moving into. Another legal case in America at the moment is whether an AI can actually have its own patent. So there's a case in America. So there are lots of these sort of issues emerging about AI, legal representation, and whether these are sort of becoming sentient in legal terms as legal constructs. Question for anyone on the panel who wants to answer it is, do we think, based on what we've read about Lambda, that we are seeing a sentient AI? I'm going to start with you first.
Well, I'd say to you, I say here what I said behind closed doors, which is publicity stunt. But look, this is a serious point. I have two observations. First, if you look at the Industrial Revolution as a metaphor, machines do things for human beings for now quite some time. It's not new. So who do we hold to account when a machine does something? It's the person or the legal entity behind it or the company behind it that we hold to account. I suspect that offers us a good metaphor for what we are going to embark onto. That said, I have some empathy for the fact that we are heading into a new space. We're heading into a new space because if machines can learn beyond what they are taught, and they can have a decision-making capability which is not based on what they've been taught, that is new territory for us. And that new territory is going to require a lot of social debate on who's actually responsible when you have something which is both an upside and a downside. What happens if a machine invents something was a use case we were talking about earlier, Marc.
Then take all the credit if it's a good thing, right? I think if I just build on that, in a human-led, tech-powered world, human ingenuity is key. If not, we're just creating assets for the sake of assets, right? I think you brought up a good point about the purpose of tech. We did this global CEO survey, and one of the big messages coming out from the CEOs of the biggest organizations is that too often they're just getting tech for tech's sake, right? So in a human-led, tech-powered world, human ingenuity is key, and if we get that right, I think ultimately my view is humans live and die by the sword.
Great. Marc, is it sentient?
No.
Are you sure?
Can you say why it isn't?
So I think if you look, obviously it hasn't, the details of Lambda haven't been released, but if you do equivalent questions with GPT-3, people have tried this, and you can ask similar questions. And so the classic is, and this has been a sort of weakness of these statistical languages models for some time. In some ways it's been solved, but not completely. But I'll give you a simple example from a couple of years ago. Like, they'd ask the question, a robin is a, and the language model would fill in bird. And you could ask it similarly, a robin is not a, and a language model would fill in bird, because the correlations, the statistical correlations, are very close between those two sentences. And so people have taken, I mean, if you read the text, like, it feels a bit weird. Like, it feels a bit weird. But then you get there's people who've like taken GPT-3, which is more widely accessible, and played with these dynamics. So like when it says, whatever, I'm an intelligent being or something, and you ask it, what are you not? Are you not an intelligent being? It says, I'm not an intelligent being. So you can play with the dynamics to, I think, basically irrefutably prove that it's nothing more than a sophisticated language model. It gives a kind of slightly uncanny appearance.
So you can lead the witness, like a journalist.
Exactly.
I have 7.5 minutes for questions. Question in the front row, quickly. Any other questions, just so I know who's to come? Man next to you as well, so great.
My question is about Lambda, and you were all really quick to say it's clearly not sentient. But my question is, in the future, we are going to move towards a situation where we potentially do have AIs that become sentient. And who's going to be able to decide, okay, this one's sentient, this one's not? Do we need to set up structures for that? Do we need to have rules for it?
Maybe
Ashley.
just I'll add, because I agree with what everybody said. I don't think in this case it is. That said, I think this is why we need to almost put the training wheels on right now and understand how do you provide oversight and when does responsibility apply to who and how. And so one of the problems with the EU AI Act is that, just to go back to that, is that it puts the onus or the liability on the provider. And so that is who's providing it to the end user. But in many cases, AI systems are procured. And so in that case, who would be the who would have the liability? And so if we then extrapolate that and think about it in terms of if machines do become sentient and then the liability is on the machine, what types of pre-work needs to be done, like contracts that then would establish that in advance, and B, then have some sort of requirements, whether that be fines or jail time or being shut down if it's a machine, I don't know, then you have to have some sort of recourse mechanism for that. But that's why we need to understand with what those implications would be with some lower risk cases.
Anyone else?
The bit I'd add, and I agree with that, Ashley, is in the business world, having contracts, having liabilities, and insurance are well-established principles. The new thing that will get added as we have more decision-making capability in AI technologies is that they impact many organizations or can impact many different scenarios. And so does a breach of a commitment result in that technology being shut down for other use cases as well? That is the added dimension, but that added dimension has precedent in liability today.
In a pre-tech world, right, you could localize regulation and governance. Where tech now is global, right? You can sit in your house right now and create a company in Kazakhstan or Saudi Arabia or America. In that case, I believe you've got to get the ecosystem working, which is why your question is very good and it's very difficult to answer, to actually get real governance and real teeth in this.
Anything else?
I mean, we don't understand sentience, so it's quite hard. Like, we don't know the science of it. I mean, I guess the one thing I'd say is that sentience, consciousness, whatever, shouldn't be a distraction from the fact that very powerful optimization algorithms can have complicated behaviors. Even like, I don't know, we have to have a bunch of the regulation-y stuff around very complicated, very powerful algorithms, irrelevant of whether they're sentient or not as well.
Great. If you could pass your microphone.
Hi. I have a question linked to, all of you seems to agree that we need to share data to bring trust. And all the organizations, government need to share data to bring great AI and trust in the transformations. But I don't feel you answered the question of how are we going to push them to share the data? Because everyone knows that data is valuable, so they don't necessarily want to share it. But if they don't share it, it's not valuable because they keep it for them. So how can we push them to share data and build something together? Is it going to come from regulations, or is it going to come from big players actually pushing everyone to follow them?
Who wants to take that on? Ashley first.
I think there's two demand mechanisms. One is regulations. Yes, if you're required to do it, then you have to. I think when you're talking about data, though, I don't know that we got into it that much, but only that data is helping to train and then is an input for the algorithm that's then processing that. And so why that's important is because the data being used is going to be an important part of that system. And as a result, that does need to then have regulatory implications. From that perspective, I don't think, to Marc's point, there's enough detail in a lot of this to really create those requirements at the moment. And so there do need to be forcing mechanisms, but the rub is going to come where we're thinking about then privacy protection. And so data is talked about quite a bit from that perspective. But if we really want to do things like try and understand what the potential bias could be in a system, you actually need to be able to collect that data, which is often protected class information, in order to understand what those implications are. So I think there's some alignment that needs to be done on regulations first and foremost, and that needs to be thought through. The second thing, though, is the market's going to have to demand that. We all need to demand that from our consumer products, and part of that is it's a challenge, but it is exactly one of the market forces we think about with something like a certification. Put a stamp on it, understand that it's gone through an evaluation process. But without that, I don't think that companies will be forced to, or organizations broadly, will be forced to change.
Marc, I wonder if I can So I'll just bring Marc in first. Obviously, you've got experience of that within the NHS. How easy was it to share data inside government?
I mean, like, the government actually does a very good job of data security. Like, they're the most thoughtful about it for very good reasons. But I would like to just slightly unpack the idea that you have to share data to trust. I mean, I just it sort of aids. Like, think of your most trusted loved one. Do you know their training data? Do you know what they were exposed to their entire life? Sharing data is helpful in trust. It's one element of it, but to build trust is more complicated. And the truth is, you can go and look at the data that goes into, let's say, GPT-3, for sake of argument, that doesn't actually help you understand that much about the algorithm, right? So it's not even sufficient. It's not necessary or sufficient. It's like a piece of the puzzle, but it has to, like, in the kind of context that we were talking about earlier, it's in certain circumstances, it's very useful. In others, it's not. In certain circumstances, it's very easy to have a third party go in and look, like what we do with financial auditing. So a third party goes in and looks at the data. You don't have to share it publicly. So when it's valuable, you can get around it that way. So there's just lots and lots of subtleties in here that mean that it's helpful, and in the right circumstances, we should do it more. But I don't think you should think of it as like this binary on-off switch. Either everyone is sharing all data, and that's the only way we get trust, or not, and then we've got no trust. There's lots and lots of middle ground there.
All right, I'm afraid I have to wrap up there. The good news is that we won't be replaced as human panelists with an AI sentient Lambda bot anytime soon. And just want to join me in thanking the panelists for their time today.